Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for hopping on. We'll get rolling here in just a few minutes. All right. You ready to roll, Pinker Man?
Let's do it, man. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Everybody, welcome to another episode of the Hackle Box. Thanks for joining us on this lovely Friday. Appreciate y'all being here. So Pink Man, almost Christmas time. Got any Christmas plans coming up?
Yeah, I mean, just the normal stuff, right? Watch some movies and let the wife handle the decorating this year. She's been doing all that, so I've not had to deal with lights, and that's been nice. But
Nice.
yeah, man, but it's getting festive around here. We've got the kids, so they're getting amped up about it and getting to use the excuse of be good or Santa Claus will just bring you coal. So that's always helpful around this time of year.
Yeah, and you got a big giant block of coal outside. It'd be easy for you.
Huge, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
got that huge coal pile, man. I could just dump it right in there. They think it was Santa Claus for sure. How
So
about
you
you?
guys watch it. You guys watch a lot of Christmas movies this time of year?
Yeah, man, we usually do. I mean, I think we probably watched Christmas Vacation a couple hundred times. It always seems like because it's
Uh-huh.
obviously the best one. I don't really want to fight with anybody about that, but throwing like the Home Alone movies and stuff like that, for the kids, it's always a good one. But you,
Yeah, same thing, man. Christmas Vacation by far my favorite. Looks like the chat's not enabled again. Let me see if I can figure out how to enable that for everybody.
yeah, I mean, just as a general notice, we're having all kinds of technical difficulties today too. So
Yeah, right. So maybe a
hopefully,
bumpy start, but I
yeah.
promise we're gonna get everything smoothed out here shortly. I don't even have the meeting settings here, so I don't know if I'm an admin on the meeting. We may just have to have folks throw things in into the Q&A if that works, but hold on here.
Looked like it had me as the host, so I tried to make you the host, even though I think we both got the same permissions.
Mm-hmm.
Try that.
Yeah, it's not allowing me to enable it either. Dang. All right, we're not officially started yet. Just bear with us a couple minutes, folks.
This is what happens when Eric leaves us alone.
Let me log into Zoom.
We'll just blame it on him. He's not here.
Exactly. This is all Eric's fault.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was gonna ask everybody what they were doing for Christmas, but they can't chat with us, so we're
They
just
can throw
kind of.
stuff in QA. We can
That's
keep it
true.
lively
Yeah,
there for a minute. Yeah.
yeah. Why'd I shave my beard? Yeah. So I picked up some sickness out at DEF CON on the way back, and the masks wouldn't really fit over the beard, so had to kill the beard for a while. But it's coming back, so it's coming back in pretty soon here, I think, and deal with it. I do have to say, as much as I love the beard, it's a lot lower maintenance when it's short. So I'm not going through nearly as much beard oil and that kind of thing. Somebody asked if we have Eric's password. No, but Eric probably has our passwords. So
Yeah, Brandon is the owner of this, unfortunately. And I have no options to change the chat settings. So I will apologize for everybody. We will keep an eye on the QA.
Yeah.
And maybe we can keep things rolling through there. All right, so yeah. Anyway, back to Christmas talk. Yes, Christmas Vacation is the best movie. If you guys have more questions about Christmas movies or even your favorite movies on the Q&A, that's fine. Also, I'm a big fan of Elf, one of my favorites as well, and Bad Santa. Gotta love Bad Santa.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's funny too, not for the kids, but uh, I enjoy really garbage horror movies. Like it's just
Mhm.
a thing, right? And there's a just plethora of Christmas themed horror movies out there. Like
Oh
I
yeah.
find new ones every year, and I always enjoy uh, bringing those in pretty soon. Yeah, it's a
Oh,
Wonderful Life. Yeah.
hey, I failed it. You guys can chat now. Woohoo! All right.
Yay! Way to save the day, Oscar.
We're not Zoom admins.
No.
Does it work? Yeah, it's working. All right. Woohoo! All right.
Good job.
I think we should just start all over again now because
Sure.
this will go on the recording, and I'll have to tell our marketing team to trim the first 10 minutes here. Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Hackle Box. I'm your host, Oscar. Got the always wonderful Pinky here with me today. Eric is MIA. He's actually on his way home from Vermont. He's been off site this week. I guess consuming a lot of maple syrup and pancakes.
Yeah, I would think so. I would hope so. If not, he's
Yeah.
doing it wrong.
Well, it was kind of funny. I was talking to him on Wednesday. It's like, hey, have you been eating maple syrup and pancakes? He's like, is that a thing in Vermont? I'm like, yes, that's a thing in Vermont. I
Oh,
was like, I think
Eric.
it's a Canada thing. I'm like, it's a Vermont thing, I promise. And
That's
so
Canada. It's same place. You're far enough north. It's Canada, man.
but then he texted me a picture today when he's in the airport and it's just maple syrup everywhere. He's like, I guess maple syrup is a thing here. Yeah, it was a Scotty thing too. I see that. We actually have one of our own here at FRSecure who is a maple syrup connoisseur and makes some quite delightful batches of maple syrup every year. So if anybody's interested in that, maybe I'm not going to tell you who it is, but we could tell them you're interested in an order of maple syrup at least.
Yeah, it's serious business from him. The times I've talked to him about it, he
It
he
is.
gets into it, which is great. I mean, heck yeah, man.
And this year too, I know he's doing a like a bourbon stave in one of his aging barrels for the maple syrup. So trying to do like a bourbon maple syrup thing. So I love bourbon maple syrup. In Kentucky, we put bourbon in everything. If nobody is familiar with that yet,
Yeah.
And bourbon maple syrup is pretty popular here.
Yeah, I mean, it's two just beautiful, wonderful things, right? You can't go wrong mixing those together. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like cheesecake, man. I mean, it's cheese and cake. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
magical.
It's perfect, like the cheeseburger.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
Tom says we shouldn't worry about the chat. It's just time to get the tap on the keg working. Who's got the keg? Because I do agree it is time for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then thanks to Sam for a shout out here on Hacks and Hops. It was a great event. Nice to see you back with us today, Sam.
And no, we are not in the same office. Just both hillbillies with similar taste, I think, is probably how that worked out. Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree. I would agree. All right. So you want to talk some Emotet? I think we mentioned Emotet last month or month before last that Emotet's kind of back, right? And I know you and the gang have seen Emotet pop up in some casework here recently. And it looks like Emotet's back better than ever, or nastier than ever, I should say. And it's got some new tricks up its sleeve.
Yeah, and so it's actually funny. I think I told you we've been seeing Emotet in cases. We've been seeing Quackbot in cases, but
Mm-hmm.
they are so similar. I mean, they're essentially the same thing, right? So, Emotet started as a banking Trojan back in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we've been dealing with Emotet a long time. It gets upgrades pretty often, right? I mean, at least every few years. Been seeing it pop up out there pretty recently, so it's pretty gnarly. And I mean, just a general description of Emotet, right? It is a Trojan. Started as a banking Trojan, really to get account numbers, that kind of thing, and has really it proved itself to be pretty effective at getting infected and getting infections and that kind of thing. And it's just morphed over the years. It has polymorphic techniques, right? And I know we've mentioned that on here before, but if you think about traditional antivirus, most of it is hash based, right? So, a hash is just a mathematical representation of a file exactly as it stands, right? So if you were to open that code up, add a single period in there, it completely changes that hash value, not by like one or two numbers or anything like that. It's completely different. And so Emotet has the ability to change its own hash and move around. It self-spreads very effectively. It's also very modular, right? So the attackers can drop in the pieces that they want to use. Hey, I need VNC in this campaign, or I need Cobalt Strike in this campaign. I can set it up to deliver that kind of thing. So it is pretty gnarly, and anytime we see it, we're on pretty high alert with that.
Yeah, and I think you were mentioning it spreads on its own, automatic
It
here,
does.
and fast too, right? So if you
Mhm.
get one user that is impacted by Emotet in your environment, it can spread throughout the rest of your environment pretty darn quick.
Yeah, and it usually brings friends, right? That's kind of its big thing. Is I don't know that we've ever worked an Emotet case where there wasn't also, Quackbot or TrickBot,
Mhm.
Cobalt Strike, things like that. It's
Yeah.
usually the first stage of an attack, and that's part of why it's so effective, or is that it is difficult to detect, but it generally just needs one user to mess up, right? It's
Hmm.
almost always coming in through a phishing campaign, a bad attachment, generally a macro enabled attachment, or I saw this version was using the MSHTA as well.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, once it's there, usually by the time your antivirus or your EDR tools detect it, it's already spread. Um, it's usually hit, spread, and went somewhere else, and so you're always going to be playing catch up on it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this version too, ISID. I don't know if we've seen that recently. ISID is another Trojan that we have worked in past cases. I know that's in the new feature upgrades, I would say, for Emotet. Looks like they're using XMRig as well now in some cases, which XMRig is just a tool to steal your crypto wallets, essentially.
Actually, it mines. So XMRig
Mm.
is the miner.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, it uses your resources to mine
Hmm.
Monero cryptocurrency. And so Monero is the actual more untraceable cryptocurrency, right?
Hmm.
So like Bitcoin is got a public ledger. It's easy to, I won't say it's easy. You can trace things down. Monero, not so much. They hide everything. Um, Real quick point on the Monero miner in this too. Um, we often run into people that had a crypto miner on a system, and it's just like, oh, it was just a crypto miner. We got rid of it, deleted it, moved
Hmm.
on. Don't ever do. I mean, like remove it. Sure, that's fine if you want to do that, but ask some more questions, right? How did that crypto miner get there? What led to it being there? Because in this case, it could have been Emotet, right?
Right. And
Um,
are you sure that's the only thing that's on that system? Right. Just
right.
because you checked the crypto monitor doesn't mean there aren't other malicious software packages or
I
tools on
generally
that system.
generally tell folks too, right? If you see a crypto miner, your attack's probably already well underway, because
Hmm.
why would you do something that's going to peg out a CPU and kick off some potential alerts, and
Right.
make yourself known before you do what you want to do? We
Yeah.
saw it a ton with proxy shell and proxy log on, that kind of thing
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Certainly increasing the likelihood of being caught if you're the attacker
Yeah.
when you fire up that crypto miner. The other thing I think that's interesting about the new version of Emotet is, historically most malware is still 32-bit code base, right? But the new Emotet is actually a 64-bit code base, which also kind of assists in its ability to evade detections.
Yeah, 100%, man. And yeah, I thought that was wild too, because we've just really not seen a whole lot of 64-bit malware, even
Hmm.
now, right? I mean, it's been the case for a long, because you want it to run on as many systems as possible.
Exactly.
But now so many things are 64-bit that they're not as worried about missing out on a few
Hmm.
32-bit here and there.
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of going to be the thing moving forward. We're going to see more
Mhm.
and more malware coded in 32-bit, or historically, or 64-bit, or historically it was 32-bit.
Mhm. Yeah, and that helping evasion. One of the things we used to be able to do with Emotet was we could usually pattern it pretty well. If we saw it in an environment, we like, and even still, I mean, we haven't worked in Emotet in a bit, but just its similar friend Quackbot, we're working those, and whatever version you end up with does tend to be pretty similar, right? So if it's dropping
Hmm.
files in a certain path, then it's probably going to continue to do that. It just renames them, changes the hash, things like that. So you have to be a little more careful how you search for it. But with Emotet, it's modular, right? So, like I mentioned before, they can drop in their own bits and pieces and their own tools, and because of that, it kind of helps it evade some of those like heuristics and behavioral based detections as well. So, I mean,
Hmm.
it's really sneaky.
Yeah.
It is it's always a scary moment when somebody calls us and says, "Hey, we saw an Emotet detection." So,
Hmm. Other features too, I guess, in the 2022 upgrade is it is utilizing SMB now to exfil data.
yeah.
Have you guys observed any of that recently in casework?
Not for exfil, just generally spread, right? We'll see it used a lot for spread and moving around, but I haven't seen SMB for exfil.
Hmm.
The big one we've been seeing over the last year for exfil is and just in case no one knows, exfiltration of data, right? Stealing your data, taking that back to use it for a ransom demand or just to
Hmm.
sell it to somebody who wants it, that kind of thing. The big ones that we've seen have been Arclone, has been huge for that this year. It's
Hmm.
a cloud storage sort of trickle sync, right? So it sends stuff across HTTP, HTTPS. So just like normal traffic out to OneDrive or Google Drive or whatever. But it does it slowly so that you're not getting those huge bandwidth spikes that would tip off traditionally when we've looked for exfil in an environment, if we didn't have good logs to show like file access, we would go look at the firewall logs and say, oh, there was a huge uptick in data at this point. And you still be able to do some of that with this, but it does it, slower. That's been the big one we've
Hmm.
seen for exfil this year, and we've seen it's in a lot of cases.
Hmm.
It's been a big one. So, but I haven't seen him using SMB for exfil yet. I'm actually kind of curious how that works.
Yeah, well, no, it's more of so it's got scrapers for SMB. So if you're in an enterprise network, it'll scan automatically for SMB shares, identify data on that is exfilled in, and they're typically probably using another method similar to Arclone or what you're talking about to get the
Gotcha.
data off the network. But it does have SMB scraping functions built in now.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I thought the
Yeah.
attackers were sitting out there with like some open SMB or something they were
Mm.
transferring back to, and it's like, well, that might be fun for us if we find
Yeah.
one of those. So,
Yeah, more internal recon and discovery
gotcha.
stuff.
No,
Yeah.
that's actually, yeah, that's pretty slick. That's better than the older methods we've seen, right? Of just
Hmm.
pop into a device and 7-zip everything and ship it off that
Exactly.
way.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. So, kind of going back, two things I wanted to touch on. One, I know we talked about this on a show sometime before, but if you guys all recall, there was a big success where the United States, in joint conjunction with Europol, was able to like shut down Emotet, and they really celebrated that. And I know that I think we talked about that
yeah,
here,
we did.
and kind of laughed, and it was like, yeah, they shut it down for a couple weeks or a couple months. They're going to retool. They're going to be back. It's going to be probably more powerful than before. So we are Nostradamus. Good job. And then the second thing too for everybody, like I think it's loud and clear here that detection of Emotet is challenging, right? Even most of your standard detection tools aren't very efficient in detecting Emotet. But Pinky hit the nail on the head earlier. He was talking about like the typical the point of ingress is always a phishing email with a malicious document attached, right? And so for me, we know detection is difficult. Our best defense here is just training your users, right? Making sure your users know how to identify those phishing emails, making sure they're reporting those emails. And even if they get tricked, everybody gets phished. When that happens, knowing it's okay, respond quickly. Let the appropriate staff know so you can respond to the event.
Yeah, and the big one on that one too is that it's not always obvious that it's that it is a malicious email or anything like that.
Hmm.
It's often a contract document or something like that, an invoice we've seen in the past, that maybe that person feels like they're expecting, right?
Hmm.
We often use Emotet and this in our in this methodology in tabletops that we run because it is so common, right? So if I'm in an accounting and I get an invoice that looks like it's coming from somebody that I trust, and often it is because they were compromised before. Um, you run that document, you open it up, it doesn't quite do what you expect it to do. And a lot of times we'll see folks download it a second time, right? Let me try to run it again, something went wrong. And that's a pretty natural reaction. But anytime, I guess, just sort of for user education, if that happens, you're trying to run some document, it doesn't do what you expect it to do, it didn't quite look right, that kind of thing, just go ahead and report that.
Hmm.
Because oftentimes they'll load that document, run it, didn't work, run it again, didn't work, and then just kind of move on with their day. And then in the background, Emotet's doing its thing. It's spreading. It's doing its thing there. So it's a big one
And,
for
and
users.
and we've seen that initial attachment, right? It's not always just going to be an Excel document attached to the
Right.
email. Could be a zip. I think you mentioned maybe even a disk image you've observed as well. So there's a few different tactics that'll embed the file into another file to be able to bypass your perimeter defenses with your email system.
Yeah, we've seen it 3 layers deep, right? So
Mhm.
a zip file with a password inside of that was a .img file, which is it's a disk image, even though most people would just think it's a picture. Like if I'm just a standard user looking at that, I'm going to think that's a user or a picture. And then inside of that would be the malicious document. So it's like
Mhm.
3 layers deep to really avoid all your detections before you get to that
Mhm.
point. And that's a huge red flag, right? If somebody's sending you a file that's within 2 other layers of
Yeah.
files, like just don't.
Yeah. Are you ever expecting someone to send you a zip with an image .img file inside?
I mean, in our business, yes, but yeah,
Yeah. Right.
in a normal course of business, no. So,
Yeah, exactly.
but that
Just be
is,
aware too, and I think this goes in conjunction. Just phishing scams right now are at a high frequency due to the time of the year, right? And all those things, like we're more susceptible this time of year. People are more distracted this time of the year. We are more involved in extracurricular activities, I would say, with like the shipping notifications, purchasing, and things like that. So it's prime time for attackers to try to sneak these Emotet files into your environment. So just be diligent and tell your folks to do the same.
yep, 100%. It's we always sensitive season, right? And we always know this
Mhm.
time of year, and it's because of that. It's a lot of distraction and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking about incident season, I think last month when we did the show, you guys were already like ramping up and a lot of incident work going on and was super busy. Is that pace staying the same for you guys right now, or is it kind of eased up a little bit?
It's I mean, it always gets really heavy right around Thanksgiving, right? So we had
Mhm.
a flood of things come in around that time. Seems like it lightened up for the last week, maybe here, a few
Mhm.
days. And then I know we had a few folks call in yesterday. Probably expect to continue seeing that
Mhm.
through the rest of the holidays. But
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like I think we've talked about before. This has been kind of an interesting year in that we've had a really broad spectrum of incidents this year.
Mhm.
It seems like in 2020, everything that we ever talked to anybody about was a ransomware attack. It was one
Mhm.
right after the other, and we've certainly had plenty of those this year, but a lot of just email compromise and things like that as well this year. So,
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot more ACH fraud as of recent too. Which again, talking about just kind of the typical patterns of the season. It's attackers are more likely to be able to get those fraudulent transfers through and have a longer delay, and victims actually noticing that because of the holidays and the distractions.
Mhm.
And the reality here is that they know as well as we know. If you don't identify that and you're a victim within 24 hours, your chances of stopping those funds from reaching their account are nil. So the key is if you are involved in an ACH fraud transaction, again, is to quickly notify your financial institutions. If you do it in less than a day, there's a good chance they can still stop that transaction. If it's over 24 hours, though, your money's probably gone, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. So accounting people, beware this time of year.
Hmm.
You're a big target.
Yep, for sure. Anything else on Emotet before we boogie on down the line and change the subject?
No, I'm sure we'll be talking about it again in a month or two.
Yeah.
It's the never ending thing. It just keeps coming back, man.
Yeah, speaking of never ending things, so the next subject is a never ending thing. I think we've talked about it over the last 2 years, probably five or six different times on here. But that's proxy logon, or not proxy logon, whatever you want to call it these days. But vulnerabilities in exchange. And so there was a big outage with Rackspace. I'm sure you guys probably seen this in the news in the last week. So a week ago, actually today, I think it was overnight, like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, a.m. Rackspace had a massive outage that they had reported. And so it turns out it was their on-prem exchange environments, right? So they do hosted exchange for a large volume of clients. A large volume of clients tune of 30 million bucks in annual revenue. So they have a pretty significant footprint in that space. And turns out the entire environment was ransomed. At this point, obviously they haven't shared any details because they're not even back online yet about what the point of ingress is. And I'm speculating here, but my speculation leads me to believe this is almost certainly related to proxy logon or not proxy logon attacks. What's your take on it, Pink?
Same, yeah. As I was reading through this, it's just my immediate reaction is I guarantee this is, well, I don't want to guarantee, but I'm pretty sure this is going to be, proxy shell, proxy logon, proxy not logon, proxy something infinity, right? At this point,
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
the print nightmare. Um, yeah, it's my same thought there is that I'm sure they do their best, but those big environments like that, it's a big ship, it's hard to turn.
Hmm.
So they've got a lot of people to talk to when they want to do a patch. They've got a
Yeah.
lot of things, a lot of people have to go down. Exchange, I'm sure we have some folks on the call who have been Exchange admins. I know you and I both have at various points.
Hmm.
It's not patch friendly. It often fails when you're trying to patch it and things like that. So a big environment like that, they probably were running behind on patches. Probably got hit with one of these. Exchange boxes are a really nice juicy target. They have so many services on them.
Yeah, and the reality is too, if you just look at that volume, like we know it's public right now that sector of their business is responsible for $30 million in revenue annually. Just by doing a little bit of math and simple logic, we could guess there were thousands of Exchange servers then in this environment, thousands. And so, like, I'm sure they probably have some nice, sweet automated patching process so that they get those patches delivered. But on the flip side, I think the message we've told everyone over and over and over is patching isn't enough on the systems.
Yep.
And so, in this case, I'm anxious to see is it exactly what we've been telling folks? You have to threat hunt. If you had that server publicly available, there was any window of gap, and there was a window of gap for every server that was online. The reality is you have to not only patch, but you have to threat hunt that system.
Yeah, 100%. I would say yeah. Even if like you're saying, yeah, even if they patch, decent chance they didn't threat hunt.
Hmm.
Um, I trying to imagine some of the threat hunting on thousands of Exchange servers. You'd have to have a really pretty good automated process to do that.
Hmm.
Um, don't know if they did, right? And to be fair too, there is always the possibility because they are a big target. I mean, they do a lot. Like I said, they're
Hmm.
doing a lot of hosted email. People know about them. It may end up that this was some 0 day that was unknown until this attack or something like that too. But my gut says it's probably not because it just rarely is.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I think their response has been, I mean, I feel bad for those guys at Rackspace right now
Yeah.
because they're in a mess. They're still down a week later. And what they've been doing is essentially giving everybody who used their hosted exchange free M365 licenses for 1 year. And but their exchange environment's down and they're having to recreate all those mailboxes. So they're giving people access, urging them to set up their accounts there. And then an admin has to recreate all those accounts just to get the businesses functioning again right now. And they've even also been working with some clients to say, hey, let's just reroute your exchange to an outside email, right? So you can still get those email that are trying to traverse the system today. And so it is a complete mess over there right now. I'm sure that team is working around the clock, and I feel bad for those guys. That's got to be tough.
100%. Yeah, but I did sort of as I was thinking through this, like, man, it sounds to me like they didn't have a good DR plan, didn't have a good, they didn't have a good sort of incident handling, business continuity type plan.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe we need to reach out to them, run some tabletops for them, and let them find some gaps because,
Yeah.
you need some sort of redundancy here. And I get it, right? It's your entire exchange environment and something that huge. It's tough to have that level of redundancy, but
Mhm.
you got to have some sort of plan. And I mean, I've done a bunch of O365 migrations back in the day. That's not a trivial process. That's not just flip a switch and you're good to go.
Mhm.
There's a lot that has to be done there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we only want to mention that again for everybody because we still see cases related to this, and obviously those folks aren't listening to the show. Just so we can make sure all of you guys are aware, like those shells are still out there, right? We're still seeing activity to those shells. We're going to continue to see activity to those shells in the future, I expect as well. And then that's a perfect time for us to remind everybody about Log4j, because it was the same path here, right? So it was trivial to be able to put a shell on your system if you were using Log4j and it was publicly accessible. And that one was even tougher than Exchange, I think, because Log4j was embedded as a dependency or embedded in programs that people weren't even aware they were using that. So I think we had a lot of folks when this first happened just say, oh, we don't use Log4j. And then later find out, oh, well, we do have applications in our environment that's utilizing Log4j on the back end. And so there's a high chance, and we've talked about this, I don't think we're going to see the significant impact of Log4j probably until end of Q1 next year. This is following a very similar path as the first round of proxy logon did. The shells are there. Folks are either selling that access to other threat actors right now that they have at juicy targets, or they've already sold the access and people are staging for a more significant attack. And so just like a reminder, hey, if you had Log4j, you had Exchange, the patch isn't good enough. Make sure you're adequately reviewing those systems for signs of persistent access.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the scary part for me on that is that now we're months and in some of these cases, well over a year
Mm-hmm.
outside of those. Depending on your logs and how well you know your environment, it may be difficult to find, right? Because if they
Mm-hmm.
had a shell, came in, dropped some of their persistence mechanism, cleaned up their shell, they may not, you may not have an indicator there unless you're really digging and doing a lot of looking there,
Mm-hmm.
and you may be outside of the log window at this point. Not to scare everybody, but it's just kind of the things that we have to think about when we're getting this far out from an initial large scale thing like that.
Yep, for sure. Just be aware, be diligent. This is more of a
Hmm.
PSA than anything, I think.
Yep, 100%.
Cool. Yeah, so another it was a really interesting article I wanted to talk about, and I think this would be a good learning opportunity for everybody that may or may not understand how DNS is at play in C2 channels, right? And so there's a study that Pantera put out, and I do have some problems with the study, which we'll talk about, but I think the logic is sound. We're essentially, I think the title of this was something to do with reported, our air gap networks are vulnerable to DNS attacks, right? And so I think that's true in a sense, but it's also not true in a sense. But the reality is, like, the DNS attacks are real. And DNS tunneling is real. And so, yeah, if you have an improperly configured DNS architecture for your air gap network, it is possible that, well, those DNS attacks could be successful, but the problem is there still has to be the payload there to begin with. But even before we get there, maybe we tell the folks like how this DNS tunneling attack works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't know. I kind of just want to yell about the problems here, but I'll try to peel that back for a minute. Um, yeah. So things like we talk about Cobalt Strike a lot in here because it is still very popular, but it's not the only thing that does this.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think the newer Quackbot has this ability as well. I've been
Mm-hmm.
kind of looking into that a little bit, but
Yeah, and I think if folks are curious to go to the C2 matrix, right, and
mhm,
C2 matrix kind of shows out, so you can understand quickly how many C2s have DNS tunneling capabilities.
right. And so what we're talking about with this is that so if you think about how DNS works, right, it's a translation of a name, right, www.FRSecure.com into an IP address. And so anytime you go to a site, you have to query a DNS server. Now your machine will cache some of that and that kind of thing, and I'll talk a little bit about why that doesn't really matter in these a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times. But your machine will cache some of that, obviously, so you may not have to reach out to a DNS server, but you're most likely in a corporate environment. You're hitting a domain controller or something like that that runs DNS. If it doesn't already have the address cached, it reaches out to an address somewhere on the internet and says, hey, well, how do I get there?
Mm-hmm.
And just keeps routing that around, right? So very basic level, that's how that works. So when we're talking about these attacks and these C2 mechanisms that utilize DNS for their command and control, a lot of times it's a strange URL, or at a minimum it's a random string, subdomain type thing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that it forces your machine to reach out somewhere and keep passing that request along until it finds a DNS server that matches that IP address. And so when it does that too, it's in that traffic, right? It's reaching back out to its command and control servers. The commands for that command and control server get passed back and forth through those DNS packets.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're on one of these air-gapped networks that can reach out like that, it stops nothing, right? DNS, if you're allowing DNS through, it's going to get all of its commands in, it's going to get all of its commands out. You're going to be able to do everything
Mhm.
you want because that's just being passed along up the chain through DNS servers.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
so yeah,
and
I
to
was
explain that a little bit too, it's like, so the DNS request goes out, and so your command and control route is going to request a text record essentially. So these are DNS text responses, and in the
mhm,
text response, like you can essentially put anything you want into a text response, right?
yep,
And so the attackers are essentially embedding commands in the text response. And so the major limitations here, sometimes there are security mechanisms that'll say, oh, this is an obviously malicious command. And so to get around that, they'll often obfuscate the commands, like we see base 64 a lot. And then the
mhm,
other thing is, like, those commands or the text records have a defined limited set of space, right? You can only use so many bytes in a text record at a time. But the C2s are able to obfuscate and then chunk that. So that's one indicator we talk about, where if you see one DNS text request go out, but then you see 16 replies, that's a possible indicator right there. So 16 replies could be 16 chunks of obfuscated data. But then on the back end, when the C2 receives that response, they know to compile those chunk data together and then read and execute the commands, right?
yep, yep, exactly. So yeah, and from a detection standpoint, right, that is one of the ways to do it. But if I were to ask everyone on this call to go look at your firewall records and identify that,
Mm. Yeah,
how
in
many of
theory,
you would be able to do
it definitely works in
that?
theory, but
Yeah,
I think practicality is not really there right now.
right.
And so I think, yeah, like what we're getting to is, so people are deploying an air gap network, and either allowing that air gap network DNS access to your core DNS servers, right? And so if your air gap network can, reach your enterprise DNS servers, well, obviously those enterprise DNS servers are going to reach out to the internet and be able to elicit those text responses. The other thing we've seen where people fail, right, is they'll actually deploy a dedicated DNS server in the air gap network. But, well, guess what? That DNS server is still forwarding requests to your enterprise DNS server, which then forwards requests to the internet. And so you're able to tunnel that information back and forth. Reality here, the only way to prevent this from happening in those air gap networks is to have a dedicated offline DNS server to serve those requests in the air gap network that doesn't forward, right? And so it would require some manual effort. But the reality is, if you're in an air gap network, those air gap systems are only going to have to communicate with other systems in that air gap network. So the solution is to stand up a dedicated DNS server that only hosts your air gap network, right?
Yeah, these are just not air gap networks, right? I mean, that's just kind of
Exactly.
a that was I mean, that was really that's what I was kind of angry about with the way this was written
Yeah.
is it's like, oh, air gap networks aren't effective. They're very effective. But an air
Yeah.
gap network is an air gap network. It means you physically walk into, an area where that is only connected. You connect to that system. I don't mean jumping across a jump box or a VPN to get into that air gap network. That's not air gapped at that point. You're at that point, you're connected minimally. And don't get me wrong, that's a great solution if you don't want to go full air gap. That's a good way to handle it, and do some other DNS protections and that kind of thing. But just yeah, don't call it an air gap network if it's got a
Yeah.
connection out to the internet. It's just
Yeah.
that's not right.
That was like one of the two problems, right? One, like this study, like falsely identifies and portrays what a true air gap network is, like Pinky said there. My other problem is, like I mentioned before, is like, yeah, no shit, a C2 has DNS attacks, but if it's air gap, how's the C2 getting there to begin with? There has
Yep.
to be an exploit to begin with, because this article is portrayed like, here's how attackers are going to abuse your DNS in an air gap network. Well, the problem is they can't deploy that initial payload through DNS. That's impossible to do. They can't elicit that initial response without a payload already exploited, already deployed on the box. And so, like, yeah, no, this is DNS tunneling. This is nothing new, right?
Right.
And so I think
Right.
it was a little like clickbaity here, right?
It,
We're
it
trying to,
was.
yeah,
But the grander point still stands. I mean
mhm,
that yeah, be protective with your DNS. Be mindful that these DNS attacks do happen. You're very unlikely to detect them because I mean, it's just DNS traffic going out your network.
mhm,
It's the same reason that these beacons will use HTTP and HTTPS and DNS. It's just like that traffic looks so normal that you're very rarely going to pick up on it.
mhm.
But yeah, the identification killed me because I mean, there are air gap network attacks. I mean, Stuxnet, right? So back
Hmm.
years ago, that was an air gap network that was attacked by basically someone bringing in the malware into that protected environment.
Yeah.
Um, again, one of the cooler attacks that I think I've ever read about, but we don't have time to get into that right now. But yeah, just yeah, protect your DNS. It's strange.
I like what Anthony says. You only need
Hey,
5 websites. Yeah.
yeah, it's totally fine, man. Yeah, just do it. Just
Host
do it.
files. Yeah. Host files for the
Uh,
win, baby.
in all seriousness, there are a bunch of pretty good like secure DNS solutions out there and that kind of thing,
Hmm.
and certainly better than just pointing everything to 8.8.8.8. And I know half the people in the call have done that, and I get it. I mean, it's easy to do, but yeah, there's some good solutions out there for that.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think this article though, like I got derailed, should have just been called "How DNS Tunneling Works."
Sure, yeah, it was a good article on DNS
Yeah.
tunneling. I totally agree with
Right.
that. We should like stop doing that.
We will share that with everybody too. So if you guys want to look into that more, we'll be sure and get those links out to you.
Yeah,
Um,
or if you just want to scare your sea levels into buying you a cool new toy like
mhm.
Cisco Umbrella or something. I'm not advertising for them, just that was the first one popped to mind.
Yeah.
If you want to use that, you could kind of like, oh look, it can hit these air gap networks. We're not safe. So
Yeah, and that's the reality too. Like even when people identify the domains, right? It's quick and easy for an attacker to see like, oh, my hosts are getting burned, and go update that DNS record to the hosts that are still alive,
mhm.
right, and regain that persistence. Or a lot of times they're going to have a secondary domain already in place. So if that first one burns, they pivot to the other domain. So there's mechanisms around that. But even more so, when you find that domain, what we've seen is it's really challenging for people to identify like which systems in their environment are making that request, right? They don't have the DNS logging
Sure.
available to be able to see like who's actually creating these requests, you know?
Yeah, and yeah, and even beyond that, too, one of the cool ones that I think you and I dug into a year or two ago, the malware itself was reaching out to a sort of fake Skype domain. It was something
Hmm.
like skypeonline.net or something that was just, it was enough to where if
Yeah.
I'm just scrolling through firewall logs, I probably wouldn't have seen it. But we were doing some malware analysis on it. And what was neat about that one was every time it would reach out. So if you spun that malware up on a new system, it would reach out to a new subdomain. So it would
Hmm.
be like ms585.skypeonline.net,
Hmm.
and the next one would be 586 or whatever. So they were using that to index the machines that were being infected. And then also it was a brand new DNS request
Yeah.
every time because it was randomly generated. So they knew it had to reach out and try to find a server that knew how to get there.
Yeah, I think they were using the DNS name as essentially a UID, right, for
Right.
each host that was affected. And there are some techniques like in that place, if you find the parent domain and that parent domain is in use, sinkhole the domain, right,
Yeah.
and
Kill
set
it.
up a honeypot too, and route that. So set up a dummy IP, sinkhole the domain, route all that traffic to your honeypot, and then over time you'll see who's trying to connect to that, right? So that's one
Yeah.
effective technique to try to identify those hosts that are compromised.
Yep. Absolutely. It's a great way to handle that.
For sure, for sure. Um,
Got a question about secure DNS. I don't know that I have. Um, but
No, I
also,
haven't seen it, yeah, in the
yeah,
wild, but I think the same theory would apply through
yeah,
security NS, as long as security NS does operate with those text records available. Anything that's, can utilize the text record, commands can be passed through that text record. And we've seen this too, like that article I did, I guess earlier this year, last year, about the Rebel Yell, right? Just using essentially off the shelf software to mimic C2 type behaviors. The same mechanisms, essentially just passing commands back and forth through text records. And so it's pretty novel to actually do that. And
mhm.
it doesn't have to even be a C2 to be modified to be able to accept these requests that way.
So we had a couple good ones come in here too as well.
Mhm.
So one thing too, and Eric here asks about or mentions blocking outgoing DNS on your firewall that isn't coming from your DNS servers. While that is a good idea just in general, definitely do that. So you're routing everything through one or five, or a limited number of DNS servers that you control. The way this DNS tunneling works, it's not going to stop that because those servers are just your DNS servers are just going to pass that request along.
Mhm. Yeah, as
So
long as you
that
have DNS forwarding enabled, which you
mhm,
which you do if the internet
yeah.
works, they're just going to be forwarded to the name servers on the internet that will respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, you can do some
Mhm.
caching and that kind of thing, and sort of not have forwarding enabled, but no one does that. Just to be frank.
Yeah. Yeah, so I see Michael's question about he asked, would you have the honeypot in your production network? Really doesn't matter where you put the honeypot because you're just going to dead route this, right? So if you, and I'm calling it sinkholing, but it's really DNS manipulation. So if we find that parent domain, you can actually stand up records on your internal DNS servers for that parent domain because we're only hosting it internally, and you can route those internal records to the IP of your choice. So maybe you have a DMZ, maybe you have a production network, or maybe just have a test network that you allow routing to. And so then anyone who tries to hit that parent domain, you can forward those requests to the network of your choice internally and essentially hit the honeypot so you can see who is trying to access those malicious domains.
Yeah, yeah, and this is, to be clear, it's not so much a honeypot, and this is generally during an active attack that you know about. You're
Mhm,
going to be setting this up to try to identify all your compromised machines.
mhm.
No, I wouldn't advise putting just a general honeypot in your production network. Don't
Right.
don't do that. But
Yeah.
this is a specific use case for because, and I think maybe you and I may have missed this here. Maybe not everybody has this context of a lot of times when we're working an attack, it can be very difficult to know all of the compromised devices in an environment. And so you're always looking for some IOC, some indicator that you can use to figure that out. And if you
Mhm.
know that skypeonline.net is a compromised domain or a bad domain, anything you see trying to talk to that, you can kind of assume is likely compromised
Yeah,
and go from
exactly.
there.
Yeah, and then we are talking like crisis response scenario here. Like Pinky said,
Yeah.
it's not a honeypot in the sense where it's going to live and gather information all the time. This is more of a threat hunt honeypot. So if you're in
Mhm.
an active engagement where you have an actor on your network and we're trying to quickly identify those hosts and shut them down, this is one of those measures you can deploy to do that.
Yep.
Yeah, I see somebody's talking about how some IoT devices are hard coded for 8.8.8.8. So
Yeah,
there's no way
definitely.
to even route that to internal DNS. Yeah, it's tough. Um, yeah, cool. So that was a fun conversation about DNS tunneling and a couple of possible defenses. Um, I don't know anything else, Pink, that we want to hit on that one.
No, just be very aware of it. It is a thing. I have to. I feel like I give this pretty much some version of this speech once a week almost to
Yeah,
somebody that I'm trying to explain how this is
yeah,
getting out and how they can't block it. That kind of thing.
yeah. Yeah, so we do have the funny story of the month. This is a new segment we're doing this month. I don't know if we'll do it every month, but I like it. And so
Sure.
it's officially a thing right now. There were some malware authors and actors who managing a botnet known as KMSD bot, which is a crypto miner and a DDoS botnet. And they actually DDoS their own botnet by sending a malformed request. Pretty awesome and hilarious.
Yeah, it's beautiful, and I hope they see this and know that we're laughing at them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's attackers aren't perfect. We talk about this all the time. Attackers are humans, right? They're and oftentimes they're not even that good, right? They're running scripts and things they bought from somebody else.
Yeah, and in
But
this
this,
case, this shows
it's the
how
authors.
yeah, how
Yeah, right.
and
Yeah,
how poor they were at coding because
mhm.
the malformed request they literally left a space out. It should be a target domain space port, and they left the space out between the domain and the port, and that was enough to break the botnet.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's great. I love it. I think we were talking about this before. I had not heard of this botnet. I mean, I'm not up to date on all of them, right? I'm not. I don't
Right.
keep a running list, but there's a lot of them we've heard of and encountered, but had not heard of this one. But yeah, that's beautiful to see. I love it. Hack themselves, take themselves down.
Yeah. So my real question, like you and I were talking about this before, is okay, it crashed the botnet, right?
Mhm.
But I have to assume they had some persistence mechanisms built into these bots. So yeah, it's down. Maybe most of them went down when this command was issued, but how many of those are just going to come right back online when they restart that server, right?
A lot of them, right?
Mhm.
This is a thing that we've. I think a lot of people are aware of this, right? But it gets talked about a lot with IoT and that kind of thing, but also just like home routers, right? Home, your off the shelf home router you picked up at Target or wherever. A lot of those have had vulnerabilities, and over the years and still do, and a lot of those things get picked up to be made parts of these botnets and that kind of thing. So you're unlikely to see a whole lot of it unless you're really paying attention. But we do know that, once exploited, that a lot of those it's not like a power off kills it or anything like that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it's a Windows devices or Linux or some of these other
Mhm.
devices, I think there's a really good chance it's persistent because they
Yeah.
expect those things to get restarted all the time.
For sure. There's standard methods to those exploits, right? And it's always established persistence, right? Whether that's through a scheduled task, an auto run, or similar. But I have to believe they likely had some persistence.
I mean, if not, I don't know though, man. I mean, they had poor coding techniques here as well. Maybe they weren't careful. Maybe they weren't pushing out persistence. I don't know. I'm sure they did though.
So yeah, Charles shared. This is hilarious, Charles. Thanks for sharing that. Contact of Charles had a security incident at his company where they were extremely lucky. An attacker started shutting down all the VMs to encrypt them, but one VM was responsible for the company's connection to the internet, and so the VM went down and the attacker lost connection. That
It's
is
beautiful.
beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not enough recon before they started their attack. Huh?
Yeah. I love a win for the good guys. I love a
Yeah,
win for the good guys even more when it's because the hacker did something stupid. So the attacker.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And to be clear, we see this stuff from time to time. We were working a case not too long ago where we could see that the attacker had they messed up their script to steal an Exchange database. And the reason we were able to see this is that instead of like doing a change directory or a command to go and pull this file from a directory, they messed up and essentially made directories and made a directory structure all the way down. And so we could see the command through the subdirectories because each
Mhm.
piece of the subdirectory, each subdirectory was a different piece of the command, like copy,
Mhm.
D, exchange, whatever. And that was pretty fun to see that. So we were able to, essentially look in there and see that they were trying to exfil an exchange database.
Mhm.
And stuff, yeah, stuff like that happens all the time. Um,
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I totally got distracted by Shane's awesome and hilarious comment. The attacker must have been a panda because they bamboozled themselves.
all right, Shane, we're gonna have to talk
uh,
later. No,
no, I love
no,
it.
it's a good one. It's a
Bring
good
them
one.
on.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, totally a dad joke for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool. We had one more thing I just want to share with everybody. I did talk about this on the Unsecurity podcast. So if you listen to that too, you can be bored for a few minutes, but essentially wanted to make sure everybody was aware of this. CISA has implemented a new act. It's called the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act of 2022. This was actually signed in like in April of this year, but they are starting to publish some rules around that, what those rules mean. And I expect there's going to be more updates to this over the next year still. I think they had 24 hours to finalize, or 24 months to finalize everything, and so there will be changes still to come from here. There is also a call right now for public input, so if you guys look at this act and you have input, I would urge you to participate in that and provide your feedback to them. I think it's important that we all contribute as a community the best that we can. But essentially, it's a new rule set that is going to govern how you have to report incidents to CISA if you fall into critical infrastructure categories. Now, I did want to tell everybody what critical infrastructure categories includes because it's probably a lot more than people realize right now. And so it's important to familiarize that as well to see if you will be required to comply with this. But they're considering the following critical, which is chemical, commercial facilities, communications, critical manufacturing, dams, defense industrial base, emergency services, energy, food and agriculture, financial, government facilities, healthcare, IT, nuclear, transportation, and water facilities. That's a lot.
The IT one alone is going to be
Mhm.
interesting, 'cause, like MSPs and things like that, but
Mhm.
it's valid.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. This one's
So
interesting. Yeah, go ahead. I think you're
yes.
about to jump into this.
Well, I'll let you hit
Yeah.
what you're going to hit. So the guidelines are: if you have a ransomware attack, you have to report that within 24 hours. All the other attacks, I think this is what Pink's going to talk about, you have to report within 72 hours. You can report that. CISA does have a reporting website, or there's an email address that you can email CISA. They do have guidelines how to tell you what you're supposed to include when you report there. If you fail to comply, the attorney general can enforce subpoena and civil action. So I think they're going to be pretty strict on enforcement of this. Now, what I find interesting is, think what you find interesting. It is the types of activity that should be reported to CISA. They need some work here.
Yeah, so there are several that are questionable, but my favorite one is port scans, right? Have you been scanned? And it was port scans, right? It's not just like vuln scanning from the outside, as far as I understand, which, very similar. I bet if you go look at your devices right
Yeah,
now,
it just says scans.
yeah, just scans, right? If you go check your logs right now, you've probably been scanned since you've been sitting on this call. Everyone's getting scanned all the time, and if you've got to report that within 72 hours, you might as well just set up an automated task, like an automated email to fire it off to seize it. Yep, we got scanned, because that one's going to be big. Surely they'll fix that and put some more verbiage around that. But yeah, that one's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that one, and also the other one is repeated attempts to gain unauthorized access to your systems. If you have an accessible system right now, someone is attempting to access it. I guarantee it. Like Pink said, since we've been on this meeting, you've probably had multiple attempts. So get to reporting.
Yeah, to get to work. Yeah. Like Coral's mentioned here, set up scheduled task
Yeah.
to go pull the logs down for the last hour, and just forward those on over to see. I'm joking. Don't do that. And all your lawyers are going to be calling me here in a little while. What are you talking about? Don't advise that. But yeah, you're getting scanned. You're getting attempted your authorization attempts all the time, all day, every day, to any external device. We get a lot of calls in, and this is I mean this in no way to disparage people for doing this. I want you to do this because I want to work with you and talk to you about it. But we do get a fair amount of uh, triage requests into our team of folks who just turned on logging and they hadn't been looking at logging before, and it's on some external system, and they're just seeing just thousands of failed login attempts and port scans and all this kind of thing, right? And it's really surprising to a lot of people how often that's going on. And that's why we say if a system doesn't need to be exposed to the internet, don't expose it, because eventually something's going to get through. But yeah, I think people are really, and obviously CISA here is a little bit um, unknowledgeable about how often that happens. They should know that, but
They should know that. Yeah.
yeah,
And I'll give them grace here. Maybe it's the first draft. There are going to be modifications to this. And
yeah,
I will say, like, on a positive note, I think there's a lot of potential here for this to be a good thing. The more that
mhm,
CISA knows, the more they're able to aggregate information and disseminate information, including IOCs, to people to hopefully be able to use those and prevent and stop other attacks. So I like the idea. I think it's a step in the right direction. But we'll see if we can get to where we need to be.
yeah. I'm actually pretty pumped about the IOC share because we know that doesn't happen very well right now. Generally, by the time we get a CISA alert or an FBI alert on IOCs, they're 6 months old and completely useless.
I've
Um,
seen them do better this year. I think I will give them the
yeah,
credit. They have done better
sure,
this year. But I do agree. There's still a time lag there
yeah,
from when they have the ability to get this information, disseminate it. So hopefully this reduces that.
agreed. And yeah, I'm pumped. I hope it's an RSS feed we can just subscribe to, right? It'd be great.
Mhm,
So,
for sure. All right. I think that's going to do it for today. We're at the end of the hour. Sorry we wasted like 10 minutes of everybody's time to get started. But hey, this was smooth sailing. I promised you it would be. We got there.
we did get there. Yep.
Yeah. So, hey, Merry Christmas to you, Pinky, and Merry
Yeah,
Christmas to everybody listening. I hope you guys have some good time, holiday time with friends and family, and get to enjoy yourself. Get a little R&R sometime.
yeah, definitely. Merry Christmas, everybody. Definitely get some rest.
Hmm.
This is the time. Get some rest. So, yeah, Merry Christmas and all that good stuff. Eat some
All
good
right.
food.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, everybody. We will see you in the new year. Adios.
Everybody.